Peyton Smith.
Dave Hawks.
Welcome, man. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to my dog as well, who's already ruining this moment for us. For those of you who are watching, I'm sure you see her running around in the background every once in a while. She gets excited when she has visitors, and her name is Smoke. We'll hopefully not always have her as a distraction. Dude, I'm so genuinely so thankful that you're here. It's something that's really funny about, our friendship. You're not someone who has been a consistent person in my adult life, but we grew up together a little bit, went to the same church. Our families were pretty well connected. And so even though you haven't been consistently in my life as an adult, you have always been one of those people that every time I see you, every time we reconnect, it's kind of like no time has passed. Yeah. And there's a level of, oh, that guy, man, I love that guy. He loves Jesus. I know what he's been up to. And there's just a closeness and a familiarity. And so I'm so thankful for that. I think that's really rare to have in relationships, and where you can kind of just get back and meet with someone again, and it's just like you never left. The reason that you have not been a consistent part of my life is because you have lived abroad since post-college. And so you are rarely back in the States. And so we go to the same church when you are here, but that is rare that you're back. And so I would love to kind of hear about, as a 20-year-old, you decided that you were going to start your career, start your life living abroad on mission, specifically serving Jesus. So how did you get there? Why was that the way you decided to go?
I think to understand that decision, you kind of need more backstory.
Okay.
So, I mean, you know this, but my story is I kind of grew up in the mission field. My parents were missionaries. I was born in Thailand and lived most of my life between Texas and Thailand. So I was born there, but I came back to Texas only after a few weeks, and was raised here in Austin until I was 10. And that's when my family decided to go back, and we lived there until I was 18. And so missions was a big part of my life growing up. My parents, they were in Thailand doing mission work with Crew. So they were essentially serving the local Thai ministry to help equip them to evangelize and disciple their own people, mostly focused on college students. And I was exposed to that at a young age. And that that definitely affected the way I saw the world. And there's, many instances that have led me to choose the life that I've chosen to live today. But yeah, that was a big one. But man, I don't know. I think the biggest thing in understanding why why I'm a missionary in Spain is to understand how my journey to faith. Mm-hmm. And I was actually yesterday, I was talking with a buddy of mine from Thailand. He lives up in Temple, and we were just hanging out, kind of talking about this podcast and the Wait What podcast, what is our moment?
Yeah.
And we both kind of share one, and it's whenever we started doing street evangelism in Thailand at this night market. Yeah. So
where at, you say?
In a night market in Thailand. So it's called the Night Bazaar. It's in Chiang Mai. If anyone's ever been to Chiang Mai, they know it's the main downtown attraction. It's this market that's there every single night. It's full of touristy things, lots of food options. You can go watch a Muay Thai fight. Also, there's lots of brothels. It's like a kind of red light district, but also the main tourist area. And so when I was in 8th grade, one of my friends' dads invited me and my buddy TJ to tag along with him to go down to this night market to talk to strangers about Jesus. And I had never done anything like that before, never even crossed my mind. But I was just happy that an older man was taking interest in my life. And so I was okay, let's do this. And so I went. It was me, TJ, and TJ and I and my friend Joel, and we would tag along with Mr. Miyakawa as he would walk around like engaging tourists in conversation and asking them, like, I don't know if you know Ray Comfort, but like, it was like Ray Comfort's a evangelist that's he's really big on like YouTube.
Yeah.
But basically he has a strategy where he has all these series of questions. But the main question is, if you died tonight, where would you go? We went around, like, it took me about a month of like watching him engage in these conversations for me to get the courage to actually engage someone myself.
And how often are y'all going with him?
We did it every Saturday night.
Okay, so weekly you're doing this.
Yes. Yeah, pretty much every Saturday night for, I mean, it's an ongoing ministry, actually. It still exists. It started with Mr. Miyakawa doing this thing. It's actually still around.
That's incredible.
Which I didn't realize until recently, that it's still an existing ministry. Yeah, so we would go out, and it took me a long time to gather the courage to actually, talk to somebody. Let's talk to a stranger about faith, and like experience the rejection of like, okay, like, I don't know. I don't know how I was really bold as a kid. I don't know where that went. I still am, but not to that degree.
Right.
Where I could just like walk up to any old stranger and just like, hey, I have a question for you.
When you die, where are you going?
So,
yeah.
But really that experience did more for my faith in like realizing the people didn't have real answers to what, like, every single person has a completely different idea of what's going to happen. And it's very arbitrary. Like, it's based off of whatever they feel like is going to happen, or, there's also tons of different religions. And in Thailand, it's a melting pot. It's a Buddhist country, but there's tourists from every part of the globe. And so you get a whole melting pot of ideas. But what it did for me was it made me realize, like, I need to understand the Bible in order to do this well. And so I started reading the Bible, like, actually, like, reading it seriously and taking real interest in the Bible. I think, what really did me in was reading Ecclesiastes for the first time.
Yeah.
As a kid. And
how old?
Whatever 8th grade is. So
at like 12, 13.
12 or 13 years old. Yeah, 8th grade, 9th grade. I was 8th grade. But yeah, if you really want to like ruin your childhood, read Ecclesiastes, and because it just talks about how meaningless
everything is meaningless.
And that, like, I was already probably because I got to experience like a different childhood where I was exposed to different cultures. I was already kind of existential. I like cared about big things that maybe my peers didn't care about at that age. But that really made me realize that I could get anything that I wanted. Like, I don't know, I could get all the wealth that I ever dreamed of, all the fame, all the women, and nothing would ever fulfill the void in my heart. And it's all really like utterly futile. Like the sun's eventually going to burn out. Like, everything is ultimately futile. What's the point in anything?
And for you at 13 years old, that was like a real feeling?
Because at the time, that's like, you're forming your identity. You're trying to, I guess, decide like what you want to live for.
Yeah. And
I'm realizing that every single avenue that I'm like aiming myself towards, like, most kids want to be like famous, or they want, I don't know, they want to be good at sports, or they want to be whatever. And I just was like, all of those aren't ultimately going to be fulfilling for me. So what's the real point? But what that did is it made the gospel come alive in a whole new way, that I like began to realize that Jesus is the fulfillment, that like I always kind of think back to that Saint Augustine quote, which is like, and I'm gonna butcher it, but
paraphrase.
like, there is a God-sized hole in our hearts, and we'll never be fully satisfied until we're satisfied in Him. And I understood that, not knowing who Saint Augustine was, obviously, but kind of began to realize that at 15, and that really started my journey of faith. I mean, I had come to faith as a kid. I can't really pinpoint an exact moment. There's a few, like, I think the time that I understood grace, I was at a summer camp in Colorado, and I remember like being very overwhelmed and kind of bawling, actually, because I realized that God loved me enough to die for me. So, but it really, I don't think that Jesus became Lord until much later, when I understood that I need to like live, that He is the only thing that's going to be ultimately fulfilling, and I need to live for Him in order to experience the fulfillment.
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, that's incredible. It's as someone who relates to being existential too young, and thinking big, and thinking, thinking meta as a teenager. I think it's awesome. I mean, I think it's incredible that as a 13-year-old, you're able to say, well, the Bible says that all of this isn't, all the things you're talking about, world, those aren't going to fulfill. And so why try? So obviously, you know, we want to be like our parents, and whatever we see and whatever's modeled to us, we tend to gravitate towards. When did you decide that you were going to truly go abroad for work after school?
I mean, I've always had a sense of adventure. Before we even moved back to Thailand, I was planning in my mind. I was planning like these trips to the Amazon. I was going to be like a jungle explorer.
Nice.
And I had a little posse of friends, and I would like assign them different roles. Like, you're going to be the cook, you're going to be the captain of the ship, and we'd all have like. You know these people too, like Kelsey Reichmanis, Ryan Pfaff. Like, we had it all planned out. And so, I always had this sense of adventure, and that never went away. Like, actually, I mean, it's so gradual, but Hill Country always offered mission trips in the summer. So I came back, but my family would come back on furlough. And even though like I lived quite an adventure living in Thailand, it was never my adventure. It was like, it was my parents' adventure. And I wanted to experience my own adventure. And so I signed up to go on a mission trip to Costa Rica in 2010, I believe, or 11. And that really started my interest in global missions, because I went to Costa Rica. At the time, I guess I had learned some Spanish through high school. 2010, I was in high school. And I realized that I could communicate, like, with the little Spanish that I knew, it went way farther than the little Thai that I knew. And I was like, oh, I'm actually like really, really communicating with these people and building friendships. And so that grew my interest. I was already interested in like Latin America, mostly because of like wildlife and the animals. I was always into animals. But I started growing an interest for the people and the cultures and the history. And so it was going there and realizing that, I mean, that I was just so interested in the cultures, but also that like I was at the same time applying, you know, what I was learning about God, and realized, I mean, we would essentially, our method of ministry, which I don't know if it would fly anywhere else, but we essentially went house to house in this town called San Ramon, and we went with his pastor, and essentially we would go house to house knocking on doors, and they'd be like, here's a white kid, like, he's gonna tell you something. And we were just like the way to get into a conversation. And we have these, have you ever seen an Evangel cube before? No? It's this like cube that it's like a Rubik's cube with different sides that have different images that could share the gospel message. So we had one of those, and I'd share it. And then really, I mean, then the pastor would actually like butt in the conversation and start sharing. And I didn't speak Spanish, so I didn't know what he was saying. But after like 15, 30 minutes, the people would start crying, and then we would pray for them, and then we'd move on to the next house. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, that never happened in Thailand. But like, house after house, 10 houses in a row, people are like praying to receive Christ. And granted, I mean, they already have a background in Catholicism, and maybe it's just for them like a tradition. But you know, they're coming to faith, and then coming to our Bible studies, and I'm like, what the heck? Like, this is like so fruitful. And I was like, just genuinely, it grew my faith so much, realizing that this is like, that this could happen.
Well, yeah, because that doesn't happen here, right? Like,
yeah.
And to be fair, our culture is pretty much said no thank you to Jesus, because we don't really have a need for him in the practical sense, right? Most of us aren't in poverty. Most of us have enough to take care of us, and we have the fruits of and the blessings of kind of the Western world. And so there's this really big disconnect between, well, why would I need Jesus if I kind of have everything that I need and everything that I want? And so we, especially as Christians now, think, oh, if I go and knock on the door and ask them what they believe about God, it's like they're going to slam the door in your face.
Yeah.
Because one, they either think you're crazy or they've seen something else that's kind of distasteful or whatever. And that's actually really new in our history. Like prior, I mean, it's very recent that people were comfortable being apathetic towards the idea of the divine. Right. Like for most of human history, everyone has believed in God in some capacity. Everyone has believed certainly in kind of hell and evil. And so the divine has been a part of humanity for most of history. It's very recent that the idea of like, oh, I can afford to not care.
Post-Enlightenment era.
Yeah, I can afford to not care about whether or not God exists, and it doesn't even matter to me. Like, that's relatively new. And so when people think about going on mission, especially in America, to other places, it's like, well, you just go and talk to someone about Jesus. You like go and ask them questions about
a white savior.
Yeah, like you go ask them questions about
spreading your religion.
Right, like being oppressive with it. And yet your experience was after 30 minutes of a conversation with a stranger.
That I wasn't doing.
Yeah.
Also, the pastor was like, I'm just a tool that they're using.
Right.
There's like, okay, we're going to use the white kid because they don't see a lot of white kids, you know? And so, but they were just using me to get in, to open the door so that they could actually share the gospel with these people. And yeah, I mean, that was...
And God moved.
Yeah. So that inspired... I was going to say this inspired the shit out of me, but it did. And really emboldened me in my faith. And I took that back to to Thailand.
You can have some
and
water.
Also, like, yeah, thank you. Another big element was boot camps, backyard Bible clubs. That was also like, it's kind of a perfect storm of like, there's a bunch of kids together learning about how to share their faith, and they're all in the same place in these camps, away from their parents, and most of them are just there because their parents sent them away, and they have zero real interest.
Right. Or their friends in high school, their friends in school are doing it. So they're like, well, it's a fun camp experience. So I'll just go for fun. And
I was, I mean, I guess I was already taking my faith seriously. And so I remember trying to start like a Bible study within the camp. And I can't really even remember what we called it. But you might know some of the people that were there, like Zach Falk, Ryan Fontenette Mitchell, Dylan Brandeis, a bunch of those guys. So yeah, we started this like little group of like, we would try to do accountability groups or whatever. It was mostly just a bunch of middle schoolers like punching each other and trying to like be serious about their faith, but like super immature. But I did the same thing. Because I started that group in Texas, I decided I would do the same thing in Thailand with a group of my friends in Thailand. And we called it Be Real. And it was a bunch of my best friends who are all walking with the Lord today still. Like, pretty much all of them are. And most of them can look back to that moment and say that's when they began to like take their faith seriously. And all of these kids were, they're all sons of like other missionaries. A lot of them had already, in a way, placed their faith in Christ. Maybe it wasn't like a personal decision, but it was their worldview, But a lot of them, like my friend TJ, for example, that I was just with, he says that was his like moment of like coming to like taking his faith seriously. And it's like we have a friendship now that I don't think many men like my age have, where I've been friends with them since middle school. We still call pretty regularly. We try to see each other once a year. Like most of them have kids and families, but we're still like so close. And I'm like, I attest that to the fact that we're all brothers in Christ. And
absolutely.
We began to like walk out our faith together at a young age. So
as someone who experienced faith really early and took it seriously really early, one of the true things that we know is that the moment you really start submitting to Jesus, that's also the time where the devil kind of says, oh, no, like I'm going to do what I can to stop you. And that's when temptation starts coming in. And that's when, as soon as you're about to take Jesus seriously, I think is often when you start being presented with the desires of your flesh that become very available to you.
Yeah.
And for a lot of that, including me and including my story, that can take you down kind of a path of saying, hey, Jesus, maybe later, but I'm going to kind of do my own thing for a little bit. Like I'm good, I'm saved, so let me just kind of experience life. I don't want to assume that also happened to you, but one of the questions that I have is, if and when that season happened, if you could go back now and talk to that version of Peyton at whatever age it was, what would you want to tell him, especially if you knew that he would listen to you?
I would say don't think that you're the exception, because I mean, yeah, I just thought that a lot of it came down to like wanting to experience relationships that I maybe shouldn't have at that age. And thinking that I was mature enough in my faith where I wouldn't be swayed by other people's like worldviews. And I thought I was the exception. I thought I was wise enough, and it did a lot of damage to guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life, like take that extremely seriously, because, I think romantic relationships, that's the biggest thing. It was like I was a high schooler, and I wanted to experience all that life had to offer when it came to that. And all my friends were, had girlfriends, and I didn't. And, kind of maybe fell in love with people that weren't good for me because they didn't share my faith. So, but I think the Lord protected me a lot, in that I always struggled. I was like always, I never gave in fully to temptation in that way, but I did. It definitely challenged my faith a lot, where I was just thinking the other day about that verse. 'Cause this is still a struggle for me. Like, and I'm reminded of it often, but I was thinking about that verse. I think it's in Corinthians, where Paul says, like, if Christ isn't resurrected, we are the most to be pitied, because, like we as believers, we really do give up a lot of pleasure in this life to follow Christ. And a lot of, following Christ is denying yourself, taking up your cross and following him, which is not easy when you're faced with what seem like good opportunities. Yeah. So yeah, like it truly, we are to be like felt sorry for if Christ isn't resurrected, because we're giving up a lot of good and I guess good in this life for something that's not true,
Yeah. It's, Jesus talks about the nature of the kingdom of heaven being upside down. Mm-hmm. That so much of what we believe in culture and in life, it's actually the opposite that's true. And it kind of makes me think about something God's been teaching me recently, really recently. So I'm coming off of a hard week in my life, and probably one of the hardest weeks that I have ever consciously had, I think. And what I mean by that is
unconsciously.
Well, I'm sure I've had harder weeks where the stakes of what happened were actually worse, but I didn't maybe understand. So whatever I was going through was just kind of tough. But because my values were in the right spot, the difficulty didn't really affect me as much. This week has been one of the first times where I guess I've never felt the visceral, physical effects of pain and kind of heartbreak and anxiety in a way that's like, oh, I didn't know that this could happen. Like, I didn't know I could feel this way. And so I don't want to get into it. I don't need to get into it specifically. But a few months ago, I had a really close friend of mine who, they're a big reader, and in efforts to engage and invest in that relationship meaningfully, I wanted to partner with them in being a reader myself. Because if you know me, you know I'm not a reader, and I wish that I liked to read. It's kind of the one thing I wish was different about me. It's one of the many things I wish was different about me, but it is one of the habits I wish that I had. And so I had started to read some books that I had on my shelves, and I wanted to kind of do that as a way of building that relationship and investing in it. And so I've been reading a book called So You Want to Be Like Christ. It's by Charles Swindoll. I'll hold it up for people who are watching. And this was a book that was given to me in college. We were going through it as a peer team of small group leaders. And it's about kind of 8 spiritual disciplines that Swindoll kind of says these are essential for being like Christ. And so I'm reading this book over the last couple of weeks, and it's really been powerful for me. And then this week happened. And as this week happened, I was finishing it, and the last spiritual discipline is sacrifice. And I will try to get through this, but I want to share some of what this book said as it relates to what you're talking about, which is, man, if Jesus isn't real, then we are to be pitied. But we know that he is. And anyway, so Swindoll in the book is talking about the story of Abraham. And for those of you who don't know, God has given Abraham a promise, in which is that he's going to make him a great nation through him. And so despite that being a promise, Abraham goes 96 years with no children. So the promise is that he's going to make a great nation through him and through his line, but he hasn't had any children. And so at the age of 97, Abraham and his wife finally have a baby, Isaac. And shortly after Isaac is born, and as Isaac becomes a boy, God looks at Abraham and says, sacrifice your son to me. And it's so hard, because not only is this the one thing that is going to allow Abraham for God to fulfill his promise, but now God's asking for it back, which is not only do I have to do something horrifically difficult, but it goes counter to what I thought you were trying to do, God. And so in the book, Swindoll says this. He says, this faithful servant said by his actions, you're more to me than any relationship will ever be. If you tell me to put the most important person in the world on an altar, I'll sacrifice him. To give up someone we love often feels like the most senseless sacrifice of all, which only intensifies the pain. And then he quotes A.W. Tozer, another well-known author, and Tozer says, "We must, in our hearts, live through Abraham's harsh and bitter experiences if we would know the blessedness which follows them." And then Swindoll continues, he says, "God may be saying to you, choose me, sacrifice her. God may be saying to you, you have done all you can do. Let that person go. Let me have that now broken relationship as an act of worship." The word is sacrifice, and God will provide. And the wait what moment for me, and this is something that I've known to be true, and is just kind of I'm being reminded of, is that the greatest form of experiencing the fulfillment of Jesus is through sacrifice. And that's the opposite of what we're told, which is get, go for what you want. If you want something, do it. If you have a desire for something, that must mean it's good for you. And Jesus says, no. Sacrifice, give up, let go of the things of your heart, and in turn, you can experience me. And so as I've been kind of sitting in this week, I've been in Hebrews a little bit, and in Hebrews 12:2, well, I'll start with 1. "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." So joy is what Jesus looked forward to, which means the joy that we have in life is not based on our circumstance, because Jesus went to the cross, the greatest evil that's ever happened, the most pain that's ever happened, the worst thing anyone's ever experienced in the history of humanity. And it says, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. And so there's a fundamental truth that I don't feel right now, and I don't like right now, but is that sacrifice is where joy is found. And that's a wait what moment for me recently, which is just like, I can have joy not because of my circumstance, but because of who God is and what he calls us to. And that's wild. That's just wild. And there's a part of me that hates it because of my flesh. But I also know that God's removing the idols. And he's saying, hey, you had this thing that you were finding your identity and security in. And it ultimately, like you've seen, will leave you empty, feeling rejected, abandoned, and not good enough. Those aren't what I have to say about you. But being fully dependent on me as God, you will experience the truth of who you are and who I call you to be. And that's where you can find life. And so, yeah, just the idea of like the life that Christians live, while from the worldly view feels like such a restrictive and it feels not fun, and it feels like you're missing out. It's because there's something so much greater that you get to experience through that sacrifice.
What you've said reminds me of a book, Counterfeit Gods by Tim Keller. And basically, I don't remember the subtitle, but it's basically a book about the main counterfeit gods of our culture: money, sex, and power. And how ultimately none of those are going to fulfill you. And those are what we base our lives on, to varying degrees. But ultimately we think we can find life in one of those areas or all of them. And that is not the way of Jesus. that those, like there's good in some of those things when it's given from God, like when it's given, like, yeah, sex is good.
When it's in the right context.
Yeah, when it's in the right context, it's good. Money is good. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy. It's not a good thing to base your identity on, though. Power is like, there's nothing wrong with being in a position of leadership. And you can use that actually as a way to serve people. But if you find your identity as this powerful person, then you're not, that's the opposite of Jesus. Jesus was a servant, So yeah, I resonate, because those are all things that's head knowledge, but following Christ requires daily getting up on your cross and dying to self, which is it's not something I do every day, to be honest.
No,
it's something that I aspire to do, but it's something
and that's been my prayer. I mean, I've been truly on my knees every day recently in prayer. And what I've been saying to Jesus is, God, I don't feel it. Like, your word says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Okay, so that's what you say. But my thoughts are anxious. My feelings are anxious. I'm fixating on a circumstance that's broken and out of my control, and I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop wondering why I wasn't good enough, what I could have done to be different. When did that thing start? Why did it start? What about me is not good enough? And I have all these questions that make my heart sink, that make my stomach sick. And it's like, I'm looking for answers as if the answers will give me life. And I think what I'm learning is that the answers to those questions aren't what will give me life.
Or they aren't answers.
Right.
It's a person instead.
Right.
It sounds
right.
cliche to say.
No, grace is a person. Grace is Jesus. And also, someone else's choice to engage and indulge and pursue in the sins of their hearts is not a reflection of who I am. Someone else's choice to go their own way is not a reflection of what God says about me or about who I am. And so sin done against me is not a reflection of me. But more than that, when I have the thoughts of, why am I not good enough? What could I have done differently? I think what God's saying is, come to me with that. Because you might not feel the peace, but you can trust in it. And it's in the process of trusting when you don't feel that I believe faith really grows. And so I've been texting some friends this week, and I was texting a really good friend of mine, and he kind of knows the situation and knows what kind of I've been wrestling with. And I'm kind of saying all these things about, like, I don't know how to function. I don't know how to do this. And he goes, Dave, I believe these are holy moments where the vague things like trust and faith, those things become really real, because you don't have a medication to take. You don't have something to just distract you or remove feelings or take your mind off of it. You sit in it and you give it to Jesus and you say, I don't know why, but if Jesus can go to the cross as joy set before him, then that must mean that even though right before he went to the cross, he's on his knees saying, God, please take this from me. So he's feeling the anxiety. He's feeling the desire for it to be removed. And yet he says, no, for the joy that is before me, I will endure the cross. And so it's not about feeling. It's not about, oh, well, if Jesus is just the solution to getting rid of bad stuff for me, I think that misses the point. And at least that's what I'm learning. And yeah, it's been a wild ride.
Yeah, I'm with you there, dude. That's a big part of the Christian walk is, yeah. I mean, I feel like in different times in your life, you come to points where you really have to reevaluate and think, do I actually believe this? You know, is this Because like we were talking about before, like if Christ isn't resurrected, then we're to be pitied, because we're missing out. There's some things that the world would seemingly have to offer that seems like a good, so it seems like a good offer, and that could be money, sex, or power. One of those things that we think we can find life in. But going back to like my story, like Ecclesiastes, like ultimately we know head knowledge wise that there was a man that lived, I don't know when he lived, Solomon, but he experienced all of those things.
Yeah, he had it all.
So and wrote it down and documented it pretty much so that none of the rest of us would have to, so that we could all realize like it's it's all vanity. It's a chasing after the wind. Like there is no real satisfaction on earth outside of the Creator. Like you have to know your Creator, and you have like that is the real adventure of your life. Is not like nothing can fulfill it. Like I've traveled so much in my life, like for someone of my age, like I've got to see a lot of the world. Traveling does not satisfy the human heart. Like I come from a really good family. I've had some really cool jobs. I have a lot of things to be grateful for, but none of those things ultimately satisfy the human heart. Because there is always a void that I think only like Christ will fill.
And we know it. I think one of the things that people say is, or maybe I should say this. I think people's response to, the idea of Jesus being the only way is like, well, how do you know? You haven't pursued those things. And I would say the evidence is in everyone that has ever chosen to pursue the flesh, the world, the desires of their heart. None of them have found fulfillment. So it's not this kind of like just blind faith. Oh, you just are hoping that when you die, all your sacrifice will be worth it. Yeah. It's like, no, I'm living now, not only seeing where I sacrifice, I find joy and fulfillment in obedience to Jesus, but also I'm seeing people that I love and care about pursue the things that they believe will make them happy. Relationships, work, money, pride, status, being the best. They believe, and they may not say this out loud, but they believe that is what is ultimately worth it. Yeah. And they tell me to my face, it's important for me to do these things. I can't make time for this, and this because I got priorities. And every single person I know who tells me that, they're miserable.
Or they might not be miserable today, but eventually when they come, it comes down to like they'll come to the realization of their emptiness eventually.
Right. They're
I think some people just live in a low grade, like you just come to an acceptance of like, oh, life isn't that great, like I will never be satisfied fully. And I've like come to terms with that. And I'm like, man, that's not how I want to live. Like I want to live the like abundant life, like John 10:10 says, like, I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. And that's another reason, like, I think, we can learn from other people's mistakes. Like we can learn from Solomon in history and like look at him and like he tried everything, wasn't fulfilling. We can look at David in the Bible who committed adultery and that wrecked his life. We can look at our peers and see how their decisions, like for better or worse, like made have either built up or wrecked their lives. And so I don't need to experience everything in this life to know what's good and bad for me. Like I don't need to do drugs to know that like drugs are bad. I don't need to have tons of sex to realize that I shouldn't have tons of sex, like, I can believe the truth of the Bible and I can learn from other people.
Well, that's what wisdom is. Wisdom is trusting in someone else and choosing to obey even when you don't get it yet. It's not waiting to do it on your own, to learn, and then be like, oh, okay. Wisdom is trusting in those truths and saying, you know what? Even though I don't know what that's like, I'm going to trust that that is not life-giving and it's good for me. And so I'm going to be obedient anyway. And you're right. Like, there are people who don't feel miserable right now as they pursue the things that they want. And I think that's really scary and that's hard, because at some point there's an existential crisis that we all feel, whether or not you're a person of faith. And so to not have something to hope in, ultimately you're going to think that at some point you'll get there. Like, you're pursuing these things because you think at some point you'll get there, and you won't. And that's why there are people who are at the highest points of their career, who have achieved it all, who are saying, what's next? And it's like, we've got truth. Yeah. Like, learn from those people. Yeah. Right. That's so true. All right, man. Well, kind of as we wrap up, I know you have a really powerful story, and you have a really powerful part of your testimony. In the last few minutes, is there anything about your story, or kind of the idea of wait what moment that you feel like is important for you to share, or maybe would speak life for someone listening?
Yeah, I'd like to share one story. There's another big part of my testimony, and that's when I realized the gravity of sin. And it came from there's so many times that I've realized that, but there's a specific instance. One time I went camping with my dad on Good Friday, and we were just laying in the tent at night, and he's like, well, it's Good Friday, we should probably read some scripture and and listen to this song. And we listened to a song by Fernando Ortega. Do you know who he is? Mm-hmm. He's a old 90s contemporary Christian singer, and he did this rendition of a hymn called Stricken, Smitten, and Afflicted. And there's a line in that song that really struck a chord in me. I'm going to pull it up. Yeah. I mean, the whole song hit me so hard at the time, because I think the thing that hit me was like not thinking that sin was all that bad, like that it's like sin is the things that God doesn't like, but whatever, but not realizing that is why Jesus had to go to a cross,
But also sin isn't about how it's against what God says, more about sin hurts you. Yeah. And that's why God said, don't do it. Not because he needs his rules to be followed for his own pride. He's just said, this is how I design things. And when you operate outside of it, it's bad for you. It's not bad for me. Yeah. It's bad for you.
Well, it is bad. I mean, it is bad for him too, because it causes separation because of his holiness.
Sure. Sure.
And so he's unchanging, right? We can't do
our sin is not going to change him.
It does.
But as someone who loves us, when we go down the wrong path, it breaks his heart.
Because of his holiness and justice, he cannot just look over sin, And it's, if you sin against a holy God, there has to be justice. Mm-hmm. And so the lyrics that hit me. So the song is called Smitten, Stricken, and Afflicted. I'm just going to read part of it. Stricken, smitten, and afflicted, see him dying on the tree. 'Tis the Christ by man rejected. Yes, my soul, 'tis he, 'tis he. 'Tis the long expected prophet, David's son, yet David's Lord. By his son, God now has spoken. 'Tis the true and faithful word. Tell me, ye who hear him groaning, was there ever grief like this? Friends through fear his cause disowning, foes insulting his distress. Many hands were raised to wound him, none would interpose to save. Yet the deepest stroke that pierced him was the stroke that justice gave. And this is the line that hit me the most. Ye who think of sin but lightly, nor suppose the evil great, here may view its nature rightly, and here its guilt may estimate. Mark the sacrifice appointed, see who bears the awful load. 'Tis the Lord, the word the Lord's anointed, the Son of Man and Son of God.
Yeah, one of the things, we talked about this in church a couple weeks ago, but what makes the gospel such good news is the reality of how broken we are. Because if you weren't that bad of a person, if your sin wasn't that great, then what Jesus did wasn't that great. But if you understand the depths to which you reject Jesus through your life and your choices, then you would understand just how significant it is when Jesus takes the cup for us. The worst part about the crucifixion, the worst part about what Jesus had to do on the cross was not the physical death he experienced. And honestly, we know that the other disciples also experienced crucifixion. They experienced
upside down crucifixion.
The pain of it physically.
Right.
When Jesus is sitting in the Garden of Gethsemane and saying, Father, if you can let this cup pass, he's not talking about the pain his body's about to go through. He's talking about the fact that that cup, what's in that cup, is the wrath of God that has to pour out because of me, because of you, because of us. And so Jesus isn't saying, oh, I don't want to get whipped and I don't want to get hung on a cross. He's saying, I don't want to be apart from you, but I have to be so that they can be with you and with us forever. And like, that's crazy. That's crazy. And it's like, yeah, the reason the gospel's so good is because of how bad I am. And like, that's why the person of Jesus, that grace is so good. And that's where obedience comes from. Today I was reading, I don't know, maybe it was in my devotional, but it was the idea of the person of Jesus' grace. And it's like if you think of grace as rules, it's really easy to break. It's really easy to say, whatever. But if you think of grace as a person, that changes. Because a lot of people say, especially younger kids in the church, they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm struggling with this. I'm still watching porn, or I'm doing drugs or whatever. I'm lying to my parents. But like, God's grace, like he takes care of it. So it's all good. And then the analogy that was made was, imagine if a husband came up to you and he was talking about his relationship. He'd been married for 10 years and he goes, oh yeah, I'm going to cheat on my wife. And you know why? Because she loves me so much and she's so good to me that she'll forgive me. And that if I go to be unfaithful to her, it doesn't matter because the relationship is so good that like, it'll be okay. And everyone knows that would actually not be what you would do. That's not the response of someone who's in a loving relationship. It's, no, I would never be unfaithful because of the relationship I have, because of how much grace there is. And so when we start to look at the grace of God as the person of Jesus, it's the relationship, then you're not motivated to go and sin because you're able to be forgiven. You're motivated to obey in righteousness because that relationship pushes you to be more like Jesus. And yeah, that's what I needed. And apologies for being so emotional all the time. I mean, I'm a crier as it is, but also
same. This week has been heavy on me too.
Yeah, so. This week's been
the gospel isn't more raw than it has at other moments in my walk. Yeah, well, I'll end with this, which is currently my phone screensaver. So I'll read it. It says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." James 1:12. And right before that, he says, "Count it joy,
my brothers, as you face trials of suffering, that the testing of your faith would produce steadfastness or perseverance. And so, man, I'm so thankful for you that you've been back in town the last couple months during what has become, I think, one of the most formidable seasons of my faith journey. God's used relationships, one in particular, to really wreck me, ruin me, and draw me closer to Him in a lot of different ways. And so I am sitting in Thanksgiving because of that. And yet I'm also sitting in devastation because I don't want to be here, and yet God's going to redeem it, and He's going to redeem me. And He's using it to draw me close to Him and rely on Him, and that's good. And so we can suffer well. And so I appreciate that you've been here amidst some of my suffering, and that you've been a light to me and just a good friend and a brother. And I appreciate you taking the time to sit down.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to share about my wait what moment. And yeah, man, it's been a pleasure.
Well, I love you, brother.
Love you too.